Hello, my name is Sean Spear. I'm the project director at the Ontario 360 project here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. We've been releasing a series of papers over the past few weeks on key issues facing the Ontario government as it develops its policy agenda for 2019 and beyond. Today we released two new papers on the question of the urban-rural divide here in the province of Ontario and what, if anything, the government can do to try to catalyze economic activity in rural and economically distressed regions. I'm pleased to be joined here with the authors, Weseem Ahmed and Lorenzo Gonzalez, who have made an important contribution to the public policy debate in their respective papers. Weseem, why don't I start with you? Your paper provides policymakers, Ontarians in general, a basic primer on the state of the urban-rural divide. Why don't you give viewers a flavor of the growing economic and socioeconomic differences between urban and rural Ontario? I think the paper identifies some particular economic and socioeconomic metrics that viewers might find striking about the growing bifurcation based on place here in the province.
That's right. So in general, we see a distinct split between urban and rural regions across the province. And this covers a lot of socioeconomic metrics from health, from age demographics. So we see urban areas are a lot younger than their rural counterparts. In terms of education, cities and small towns are much more educated. They have a higher proportion of people with some university level degree. In addition, we see that once we get into the most rural areas of the province, there's actually more people who have dropped out of high school than who have finished it. So this has a lot of consequences to it. In terms of job growth across the province as a whole has been generating jobs, but a lot of that has gone towards Toronto and Ottawa and some other cities as well. Rural Ontario has actually seen a decline in employment during the past 10 years, despite an economic boom across the province and country. All of this has translated into household income. So rural regions have lower household incomes than their urban counterparts, and we see actually the wealthiest households are right here around Southern Ontario and in the GTA.
That's one of the things I think that your paper doesn't make one of the reasons it makes such an important contribution. There's a tendency in our policy debate, in our political debate, to focus on headline data.
Right.
And I think what you aim to do is to drill down into that headline data according to place. You mentioned differing employment outcomes, that while we've been growing as a whole, the truth is most of that employment growth has been concentrated in a small number of urban centers. How should policymakers think about this? How do we develop a policy agenda that recognizes these differing economic and social outcomes? How can we ensure that public policy is rooted in a recognition of these differences?
Right. It's important to recognize that there's no one size fits all. So going back to the province as a whole mantra, we know that Ontario's population has been growing. But if you look at the census subdivision level, we know that almost half of the subdivisions have actually been declining in population, and that's only since 2011. Imagine going further back. So we have to really identify which areas are the most in need of help, what is sort of their issues that they're struggling with, and then how we can best target that. And different areas have different circumstances. So rural areas in Southern Ontario are different than the ones in the north. The ones in Southern have closer ties to their urban centers, which actually studies in the US have shown that rural areas adjacent to urban areas are more likely to spring back after an economic downturn. Rural Ontario Northern Ontario, rural centers in the north don't have that privilege. So we really have to drill down and figure out what their advantages are, target those, and develop policy specific to those regions.
That's a good segue to our second co-author, Lorenzo Gonzalez, who building on Weseem's important diagnosis of the problem, has unpacked a possible policy solution by investigating the opportunity zones model, which is being currently experimented with in the United States, and that Lorenzo makes the case Ontario policymakers ought to consider here in the province. Lorenzo, what are opportunity zones, and how can they get at this growing place-based bifurcation that Weseem identifies in his work?
Yeah, so opportunity zones are a new, innovative economic development program running in the US. The purpose is to encourage private investment in economically distressed areas. It uses tax preferences to draw and drive capital into these areas. So it wants to untap the potential portion of $6.1 trillion of unrealized capital gains that American investors hold.
That's really interesting. And so what your paper, I think, so competently helps us understand is how the model first originated and how it's been developed and now begun to be implemented. Why don't you just give viewers a sense of how the 8,700 opportunity zones were identified and the mechanism for pulling that investment, as you say, $6.1 trillion in unrealized capital gains that represents a potential source of capital for these undercapitalized places. What's the mechanism for pulling that money into the 8,700 or so designated zones spread out across the United States?
Yes, so taxpayers with capital gains are eligible for 3 tax benefits. The first is a deferral until 2026. The second is a reduction. If you keep your capital in an opportunity fund for 5 years, you receive a 10% step-up basis on your capital gains. If you keep it in for 7 years, you receive an additional 5% for a total of 15%. And if you keep your capital for 10 years in an opportunity fund, you receive an exemption on new capital gains. And regarding the designation of zones, it was pushed down to the state level, and governors from each state could designate up to 25% of low-income census tracts that would last for 10 years as designated zones.
So these designated zones now, roughly 8,700 of them are eligible for this investment coming into their communities that is leveraging this set of tax inducements that you described. One of the obvious questions is this a model that the Ontario government should consider? But more importantly, how would we go about implementing opportunity zones in Canada? Can you give us a sense of the intergovernmental dynamic and the potential for collaboration between Ottawa, Queen's Park, and other provincial capitals to bring something like opportunity zones here?
Yes, so since capital gains is set by Ottawa and there's a tax collection agreement with the federal government, the provincial government would have to approach the federal government to design a joint federal-provincial opportunity zone model, which can run in the province or even nationally.
And can I just ask one question? Because we're talking about trying to pull investment into rural and economically distressed places using a mix of tax inducements. And as Lorenzo says, well, it's still early days. The opportunity zone model looks interesting. As you said in your opening comments, it's flexible, it's innovative, it's principally market-driven. You identify in your paper not only are there this growing divide with respect to health outcomes and employment and income and so on, one of the most striking metrics in your paper is the extent to which investment is bifurcated. Do you want to just give viewers a sense of the relative performance on foreign direct investment between urban and rural places?
Absolutely. So yeah, as you mentioned, we see this bifurcation coming in foreign direct investment. The level has, interestingly, actually stayed the same since 2003 to 2017.
Province-wide.
Province-wide, that's right. But when we look specifically at where that investment is falling, we see that it's actually shifting from former northern or northwestern Ontario mining communities towards sort of the big cities, Toronto, Waterloo, Ottawa, even some cities in southwestern Ontario that were former automotive hubs, manufacturing hubs, have seen in some cases up to $3 billion in a decline in foreign investment.
Over a long period of time.
Over almost 2 decades. But that's what's been happening. It essentially follows a trend of deindustrialization across the province and a shift from blue-collar work towards white-collar
And so this process, as you describe, of growing concentration of investment in major urban centers is part of the underpinnings of the opportunity zone model. In effect, what policymakers are saying is that the market's efficient allocation of resources, if left to its own devices, will produce this kind of concentration. And opportunity zones is a relatively low-touch policy intervention to try to push the market to distribute investment more broadly. Maybe just the last question to you, Lorenzo. Do we have any sense of how the opportunity zone model is performing thus far? Are there any early lessons that Ontario policymakers should take in mind as they think about how to get at this issue of rural economic development and the possible adoption of opportunity zones in Canada?
Yes, so overall, the results have been positive. There's so much new energy, much attention into place-based policy and how we can target economically distressed areas. However, there have been some problems, such as zones, they don't require reporting, there isn't reporting requirements, and there have been some political issues regarding designations. The third concern is that the slow rollout of regulation actually induced investments towards certain assets, such as real estate, which is challenging since the whole purpose of the program is to spread out the capital in these economically distressed areas.
So one takeaway for policymakers is that if Ontario and Canada is to indeed adopt the opportunity zone model, it's important to make sure that the accompanying regulations are ready to roll with implementation because, as Lorenzo says, in the United States, they moved quickly with the regulations with respect to commercial real estate and have been slower on the regulations with respect to investing in business startups and so on. And that has contributed early on to a disproportionate share of the capital going to commercial real estate. If the goal is to have capital flow broadly into these communities, policymakers need to ensure that the regulatory underpinnings are in place and ready to roll. And I would just say, as we wrap up here, first of all, thank you so much for your contributions. I think they will make a real impact here as policymakers grapple with this important question. And I would just say, in closing, that we saw in the provincial government's recent fall economic statement a recognition around the concerns of regional economic disparity in general and rural issues in particular, and a recognition of the possible role of tax policy in trying to catalyze investment in these places. And so I think Weseem and Lorenzo should be very proud of your papers. I think over time we may see them have a real impact on public policy here in the province of Ontario. And I want to thank you and thank viewers for their continued interest and support in the Ontario 360 project. Stay tuned for subsequent papers in the coming weeks.